The coffee was still hot when Evelyn Wren walked into the bedroom that Tuesday morning in March. She had made it the same way she had made it every single morning for 40 years. 2 scoops of dark roast. Water just below boiling, poured slow the way Edward preferred. The ritual had become so deeply embedded in her body that she could perform it half asleep in total darkness without thought. It was muscle memory. It was marriage. It was the only language she had left that she was certain he still understood. She carried the cup down the hall past the framed diplomas that lined the wall in their identical dark frames, past the black and white photograph of Edward shaking hands with a senator whose name she had long forgotten, past the small table where the mail always collected in a neat pile because she sorted it every afternoon without being asked. The morning light came in through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, pale and thin, the way New England light always was in early spring, as if the sun itself was still deciding whether the cold was truly finished. She pushed open the bedroom door with her shoulder. Edward was lying on his back the way he always slept, his hands folded across his chest, his face turned slightly toward the window. She noticed in the first half second that something was different. The room had a quality to it she had never felt before, a stillness that went beyond sleep, a silence that had weight that pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the floor with the particular gravity of something permanent. She set the coffee cup on the nightstand. She said his name once quietly. He did not move. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the man she had spent 40 years of her life beside, and she understood. She picked up the telephone and dialed 911 with steady hands. She gave the address clearly. She answered the dispatcher's questions in a calm, measured voice. She said yes, she was certain. She said no, she did not need to stay on the line. Then she sat down in the chair beside the window, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. She did not cry. She was 68 years old, and she had learned over the course of a very long marriage that the most important things in life required silence, not tears. Tears were something you kept for private. Tears were something you saved for when no one was watching. She had a great deal of practice at both. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, she had counted. They were professional and gentle, and they confirmed what she already knew. And then more people arrived, a doctor, then a funeral director's representative who appeared with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being needed on short notice. And through all of it, Evelyn sat in her chair and answered questions and signed forms and said the right things at the right moments, because that was what the situation required. And she had spent 4 decades perfecting the skill of giving situations exactly what they required. When they finally left, when the house was quiet again, in a way that had not been quiet before, a way that was different from mere emptiness, she sat for a little while longer and looked out the window at the Brookline garden. The roses along the south wall were still bare. March in New England meant the roses were always the last to come back, always the ones that made you wait longest before they gave you proof that the waiting had been worth it. She had planted those roses herself that first optimistic spring. She thought about that for a while. The year was 1984. When Evelyn Ann Wren, 28 years old, walked into the offices of Hargrove and Associates for the first time as a junior secretary. The firm occupied the top 2 floors of a brick building on Tremont Street in Boston, a building that announced its own importance before you opened the door. Dark wood paneling in the lobby, oil portraits of men with serious expressions lining the corridor to the elevators. The smell of leather and old ambition and money so established it had stopped needing to announce itself. She had been hired because she was efficient and quiet and made things run smoothly without requiring acknowledgement. Her resume was modest, a community college degree, 2 years at a smaller firm in Cambridge, references that described her as reliable and discreet. She had no family connections, no social leverage, no particular expectation that this job would be anything other than a good opportunity to build experience. Edward Hargrove was 45 years old, and he filled every room he entered. Not with volume, he was not a loud man. He filled rooms with presence, with the particular gravity of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every conversation he participated in. He had iron gray hair cut close at the temples, dark eyes that assessed everything in a single unhurried glance, and the controlled, precise movements of a man who had long ago decided that nothing in his life would happen by accident. When he walked through the offices, people adjusted. Not from fear, from something more complicated than that. From the simple acknowledgement that here was someone who occupied space differently from ordinary people, who carried his authority so completely that it became in time simply part of the atmosphere. He was also, Evelyn would learn later, deeply and comprehensively alone. His first marriage had ended badly. The details were never fully explained to her, offered only in fragments over the years, pieces of a story Edward controlled the telling of. What she understood was this: 3 children from that marriage. Prescott, who was 20 when Evelyn joined the firm and already wore his father's coldness, like an inherited coat he had decided suited him. Claudia, 18, sharp as broken glass and twice as deliberate about where she chose to cut. Brett, 16, quiet and uncertain, a boy still in the process of learning which way the family winds were blowing and whether it was worth the effort to develop opinions of his own. And a divorce that had left Edward Hargrove technically free, but not particularly interested in examining what freedom might cost him. He asked Evelyn to dinner 6 months after she began working for him. She was stunned in the way that people are stunned when something occurs that their understanding of the world had not prepared them to expect. She was a woman of modest background. She did not belong to the social circles that Edward moved in, had no claim to the kind of life his world represented. She had been hired to be efficient and invisible, and she had been both. But he had noticed. She could not account for it then, and she could not fully account for it later, even after 40 years of trying. She was not the woman men like Edward Hargrove were supposed to choose. And yet he chose her with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, as though he had assessed the situation carefully and arrived at a conclusion he found both correct and necessary. When he proposed 6 months after that first dinner, she said yes, without hesitation. She was 28 years old, and she believed with the whole of her inexperienced heart that she had found both love and security inside the same extraordinary offer. She was wrong about one of those things. It would take her 40 years to fully understand which one. The wedding was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, photographed, well impressive to the guests, communicating clearly that the people involved were significant. Evelyn wore a dress that Edward's assistant had helped her select something appropriate for the occasion and the setting. She carried flowers she had not chosen. She smiled at people she did not know and accepted their congratulations with the grace that the occasion required, because grace was what she had always provided when situations asked for it. Claudia found her near the end of the reception, standing by the French doors that opened onto the garden. She was 18 years old and already in full possession of her mother's bone structure and her father's absolute certainty that she was the most consequential person in any room she entered. She looked at Evelyn with eyes that were pleasant on the surface and perfectly empty beneath. "You should know," she said, her voice conversational, almost warm, "that you will never be a part of this family. Not really. You can try if you want to. Most women in your position do, but we know exactly what you are and we know exactly how this ends." She picked up a champagne glass from a passing tray and walked away before Evelyn could find words. It was the most honest thing anyone said to Evelyn on her wedding day. She spent the next 40 years trying to prove Claudia wrong. She tried harder than anyone had a right to expect, and she did it without complaint and without keeping score, which is its own particular form of exhausting nobility. She remembered every birthday, every graduation, every occasion that required a card or a gift or a phone call made at precisely the right time. She hosted Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter with food she had spent days preparing, setting tables that looked like photographs from magazines, making sure the house was the place that felt like home, even for people who had decided long before they arrived that it would not. She maintained Prescott's childhood bedroom exactly as he had left it until he was 35 years old, when it finally became clear, even to her optimism, that he would never return to it with anything resembling warmth. She bit her tongue through remarks about her background, through comments delivered with smiling faces about her lack of a proper university degree, about how remarkable it was that a woman with her qualifications had managed to marry so well, about the particular condescension that belongs to people who believe they are being generous by acknowledging you at all. Through the years when Claudia referred to her in conversations clearly not intended for her ears, but carried far enough to reach them simply as the secretary. As though the 4 decades between that first day at the firm and the present moment had done nothing to alter the terms of Evelyn's standing in the world. She swallowed all of it. She managed the Hargrove house in Brookline with the care of a woman who had understood from the beginning that her value in this household was measured in the smoothness of surfaces, the quality of meals, the efficiency of systems that ran so well no one thought to notice them. She entertained Edward's colleagues and clients with a graciousness that people mentioned in passing and then forgot. She supported his schedule, adapted to his preferences, remained faithful through 40 years of a marriage that had somewhere in its middle decades quietly rearranged itself from partnership into something harder to name. Edward was not unkind. That was the thing she returned to again and again in the dark hours when the accounting of her life felt most urgent. He was not unkind, he provided well. He was never violent, never cruel in any direct or obvious sense. But there was a part of him, a substantial central part, that he kept behind a door she had never been given a key to. Not metaphorically, literally. The home office was locked. Always. He had explained this once early in the marriage with a patience that made her feel she was being managed rather than spoken to. I need one space that is entirely mine, Evelyn. I spend my entire working life in the service of other people's problems. Surely you can understand why I need somewhere I can simply think. She had understood, or she had accepted it, which in a marriage is sometimes the same thing and sometimes is not. The bank accounts were separate. When she had asked once in the early years whether she might see the statements, understand their financial situation as a shared thing, rather than a mystery she was expected to trust, he had smiled at her with an expression that landed somewhere between affection and dismissal. The smile of a man who finds a question charming precisely because he does not consider it serious. Don't worry yourself about the money, darling. That is my work. Your work is making this house into a home, and you do it perfectly. She had not asked again. The monthly trips were the strangest thing. Once a month, sometimes more frequently, when something he could never quite define pressed at him, Edward would pack a small bag on a Friday evening and drive north. He said he needed to decompress at a property he had inherited from a relative. He said he needed the quiet. He never invited her. He said he found it restorative to have time entirely alone. And when he said this, he said it in a way that communicated the topic was settled. She packed his bag. She kissed him goodbye at the door. She trusted him with the absolute unexamined faith of a woman who had built her entire adult life on the assumption that faith was what a good marriage required of a good wife. She was wrong about that too. She would understand how wrong and in what precise way only at the end. The funeral was massive. Edward Hargrove had been one of Boston's most prominent attorneys for more than 50 years. The city showed up to say goodbye the way cities show up when someone important dies, with numbers and flowers, in the careful performance of grief calibrated precisely to social expectation and professional obligation. Judges attended, former governors sent representatives. Former clients, some of whom had not spoken to Edward in years, came because his death was the kind of event that required attendance from anyone who had mattered in his world. The church on Beacon Street was filled beyond its comfortable capacity. People stood along the side walls and in the back and out into the vestibule, and the murmuring that preceded the service had the particular quality of a large gathering that is performing solemnity while actually conducting the ongoing business of social maintenance that never fully pauses even for death. Prescott, Claudia, and Brett sat in the front row. They had arranged themselves with evident care. Prescott, on the aisle, straight-backed and composed his grief, worn like a well-fitted garment that communicated exactly the right things. Claudia in the center with a white handkerchief that she touched to the corner of her eye at intervals that seemed to Evelyn, watching from behind, too regular to be involuntary. Brett at the end, looking at the floor in the way of a man who has spent his life watching other people's emotional performances and is not entirely sure what to do with the genuine version. They had placed Evelyn in the second row. Prescott had explained this with a tight, practiced smile before the service began. "We thought you might need the space in case you had family members joining you." He knew she had no family. Her parents had died years apart in the decade before her mother first, her father 2 years after. She had been an only child, and 40 years of being Edward Hargrove's wife had meant gradually and then completely losing touch with the few friends she had possessed before the marriage. You cannot maintain real friendships from inside a life that requires most of your available energy for its maintenance and leaves very little over for the kinds of reciprocity that sustain friendships across time. She sat in the second row. She sat behind the children of the man she had given 40 years of her life to, and she understood with the clarity that comes only when pretending is finally and completely no longer possible, that this seating arrangement was not about logistics. It was a statement, a ranking, a public declaration visible to everyone in that church who cared to interpret it, of where she had always stood and where she would continue to stand in the aftermath of Edward's death. Not one of the eulogies mentioned her. Colleagues spoke about Edward's legal mind, his decades of contribution to the Massachusetts bar, his reputation for precision and ethical clarity, the last quality delivered without apparent irony by men who had known Edward well enough to know where the precision and where the ethical clarity had sometimes given way to more complicated arrangements. A former client spoke movingly about Edward's guidance during a difficult business dispute. Prescott gave a brief, carefully composed statement about his father's dedication to his family, to his children, to the continuation of the Hargrove name and its legacy in Boston's professional community. His family, his children, his legacy. Evelyn sat in the second row and listened to 40 years of her contribution to that family described through complete omission, as though those years had not existed. As though the woman who had made the house run, who had hosted the dinners and managed the holidays and supported the career and been present through every ordinary and extraordinary thing a shared life contains, as though that woman were simply not part of the story being told. At the reception afterward, held at Prescott's house in Newton, she stood near the window with a glass she was not drinking from and heard Claudia from across the room speaking to a cluster of friends near the catering table. Claudia's voice had always had a carrying quality, not loudness exactly, but a penetrating clarity that moved through background noise the way certain sounds do, finding you regardless of where you are in a room. "It's just so profoundly difficult," Claudia was saying, pressing the white handkerchief to the corner of what Evelyn from this distance could see were completely dry eyes. "Losing him, at least we have each other, the real family to get through this together." The real family. Evelyn set her glass down on the windowsill and looked out at Prescott's manicured lawn and thought about a garden she had planted herself 37 years ago from seeds ordered from a catalog. She thought about roses and herb beds and the perennial borders she had designed to bloom in sequence across every season. She thought about what it meant to build something with your own hands and then be told, with perfectly dry eyes, that it did not belong to the story. The reading of the will was scheduled for exactly 1 week after the funeral. Frank Delacroix's offices occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, the offices of a man who had spent his career at the intersection of significant money and the legal structures built to protect it. Dark granite reception desk, lighting that managed to be simultaneously expensive and subdued. Art on the wall selected by someone who understood that the right art in a space like this said everything it needed to say without requiring the viewer to have an opinion about it. Evelyn dressed carefully that morning, a simple black dress, her white hair arranged the way Edward had always preferred it, close and neat. She drove downtown through the morning traffic parked in the garage beneath the building and rode the elevator up 42 floors with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into the expression she had spent decades perfecting. Calm, composed, entirely present and entirely unreadable. Prescott, Claudia, and Brett arrived together as she had known they would. They brought their own lawyers, 3 of them in suits, that communicated precisely what they were intended to communicate, who arranged themselves along one side of the conference table with the practiced ease of people who have been in this room before in various configurations and know exactly what the day holds. They greeted Evelyn with careful politeness. The politeness of people who have already decided the outcome and are managing appearances until the paperwork makes it official. Frank Delacroix sat at the head of the table. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with a face that kept its own counsel in all circumstances. He had been to dinner at the Hargrove house 3 times in the years Evelyn could clearly remember. He had complimented her cooking on each occasion with the specific detailed attention of someone who actually meant it. He had laughed at Edward's jokes with the warmth of genuine affection, not the performed warmth of professional obligation. He looked at Evelyn now with an expression she read carefully and could not entirely reduce to a single thing. Not pity, something more complicated, more specific. The expression of a man who has been asked to read something aloud that he argued against in private and lost the argument. He began with the formal language, testamentary capacity, proper execution, the administrative structure that surrounds the moment before the real information is delivered, giving everyone in the room a few additional minutes inside the fiction that things might still be other than they are. Then he read the numbers. The estate of Edward James Hargrove was valued at approximately $8.7 million. The primary residence in Brookline currently assessed at 2.1 million. Investment and retirement accounts totaling approximately 6 million. Various additional assets comprising the remainder. Evelyn felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. $8.7 million. 40 years of shared life. Surely there was enough here. Surely after 4 decades of devotion and service and sacrifice that had never once been publicly acknowledged, there was enough here to mean she would not have to be afraid. Frank Delacroix's voice shifted, just slightly, in the way a voice shifts when the person producing it is reading words they opposed and cannot now avoid delivering. The primary residence in Brookline he left in its entirety to Edward's children from his first marriage, Prescott Hargrove, Claudia, Hargrove Webb, and Brett Hargrove, to be divided equally among them, or sold with proceeds distributed as they determined appropriate. The house she had managed for 39 years, where she had cooked thousands of meals, entertained hundreds of guests, maintained every room to a standard of perfection that Edward had come to consider simply the condition of his life, the way people come to consider excellent systems as part of the natural order when they have never had to think about them. Not hers. The investment accounts valued at approximately $4.2 million are similarly distributed equally among the 3 children. Cold moved through her chest, slow and thorough. The retirement accounts valued at approximately $1.8 million are distributed in the same manner. She heard her own voice from a considerable distance. Frank? He looked at her. What does Edward leave for me? The room was absolutely quiet. Prescott adjusted his cufflinks with small, precise movements. Claudia examined her left hand with focused attention. Brett looked at the surface of the table. Frank Delacroix took a breath that was barely audible. I am required to read this verbatim, he said. I want you to know that I argued against this language. Edward was adamant. He looked down at the document before him. My wife, Evelyn Ann Wren, has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved through her own efforts working as a secretary. This constitutes more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years. Domestic services. She was 68 years old and she had given 4 decades of her life to a man who had just described those decades in a legal document intended to stand as the last word on the subject as domestic services. The words arrived in the room the way certain things arrive, with a completeness that leaves no room for negotiation, no possibility of revision, no alternative interpretation that would make them easier to hold. Evelyn sat with them. She let them reach her. She gave them nothing back. Prescott was smiling, not broadly, just enough to be visible if you were watching for it. Claudia had put the handkerchief away. Brett had his phone out. Frank continued his voice, doing something careful with its own quality, maintaining the professional tone while carrying beneath it something genuinely pained. To Evelyn Ann Wren, I leave one property I own located at 12 Whispering Pines Road in the town of Millhaven, New Hampshire, along with all contents contained therein. This property is given with the understanding that Evelyn will vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is required by my rightful heirs for their use or disposition as they see fit. 30 days. 30 days to gather whatever remained of a life and disappear from the place where that life had been lived. Frank slid a brown envelope across the polished conference table. His hand, Evelyn noticed, trembled slightly when he did it. One small, involuntary tremor from a man delivering something he considered wrong. This contains the deed to the Millhaven property, now transferred to your name. There is also a key and a handwritten note from Edward that he asked me to include. Claudia looked at Evelyn with the careful expression of someone rehearsing sympathy they do not feel. Daddy mentioned that property to us once, a long time ago. Said he'd inherited it from some distant relative. An old house apparently quite run down in the middle of nowhere. She paused for exactly the right length of time. But at least you'll have a roof over your head. Prescott was already standing, his attention already moved forward to the logistics of what came next. We'll need to discuss the timeline for vacating the Brookline house. We're planning to list it immediately. The market is very favorable right now for that neighborhood. The will specifies 30 days, Frank said, and there was steel in it, placed quietly but unmistakably. Evelyn is legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her affairs. That is not subject to negotiation. Of course, Prescott said smoothly, the smoothness of a man who knows he has already won and can afford to be gracious about the details. Take your full 30 days, Evelyn. We understand this is a difficult transition. Evelyn opened the brown envelope. The key was iron, old and darkened with age spotted at the surface with rust in the way iron acquires rust when it has been in existence for a very long time. It was heavy for its size. She turned it over in her palm and felt its weight and thought briefly and, without fully understanding why that it felt like something meant to open something that mattered. There was a single sheet of paper, Edward's handwriting. The precise, controlled script she had watched sign documents and write letters across 4 decades, the handwriting of a man who believed that how you put words on a page said something about how seriously you took the words. She read the note once. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. She stood. She picked up the envelope and held it against her body, her arm across it, the way you carry something you are not willing to set down. She walked toward the door of the conference room. Evelyn, Frank's voice behind her. Quiet, but with something in it that was separate from the professional tone. If you need anything, if you have questions about any of this, please call me. I mean that. She nodded without turning around. She walked out through the reception area into the elevator down 42 floors to the parking garage. She sat in her 10-year-old Honda Civic in the concrete quiet of the parking structure, and she read the note again. Evie, do not let them see you reading this. Go to Millhaven as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. They have always been watching, always looking for any reason to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time. All my love, always. E. She sat with it. Trust me one last time. After all of it, after being described in a legal document as adequately compensated domestic help, after being given 30 days to disappear from the only home she had known for 4 decades, after the funeral in the second row, and the real family and Claudia's careful, practiced grief and the sound of Brett's phone clicking in the silence after the worst sentence was read. After all of that, trust me one last time. She noticed that he had called her Evie. He had only ever called her Evie in private, only in moments that belonged to the two of them alone, in the spaces between the performance of their Boston life, where something more genuine occasionally surfaced. It was a small thing, but it was his handwriting and it said Evie, and she sat with that for a long time. She put the note back in the envelope. She started the car. She drove out of the garage and into the Boston afternoon, and she did not cry because she had learned across a very long span of years that tears were something she kept for private. She saved them for that night. She cried alone in the bedroom of the Brookline house, the house that was no longer hers, the house with 30 days remaining of being the place she lived, and she cried until there was nothing left. Until the grief passed through its first terrible wave and receded into something quieter that she could work with. Something that had the shape of a question she had not yet learned to ask. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and thought about the note and the address and a rusty iron key and the way Edward had written her name at the top of a piece of paper when he was already gone. The 30 days that followed were a particular kind of education in what people are capable of when they have decided that consideration for others is an obstacle to efficiency. Prescott arrived on the 3rd day with a contractor and a real estate agent, and a confidence so total it had become its own form of aggression, the aggression of a man who has decided the outcome and is simply managing implementation. He walked through the house with the agent's guidance, discussing the flow of spaces and the potential of walls removed and the value of a kitchen modernized, while Evelyn sat in the living room with a book she was not reading and watched them move through her life as though she had already left it, as though she were already gone and the house was simply waiting for its new purpose to be decided. The agent paused in front of the windows overlooking the garden. The plantings are quite overgrown, she said, making a note on her clipboard with the brisk efficiency of someone assessing an obstacle rather than a living thing. We'll want to bring in a professional landscaping crew before we list. First impressions are critical in this market. Evelyn looked at the garden she had planted from seeds intended for nearly 4 decades. The roses along the south wall, the herb beds she had started from cuttings given to her by a neighbor who had moved away years ago, the perennial borders she had designed to bloom in sequence from March through November So there was always something alive, always something that proved winter would not be permanent. Overgrown. She went back to her book. Claudia arrived on the seventh day with an interior designer and a certainty that whatever Evelyn had done with the house for 39 years could be dramatically improved upon. They stood in the kitchen and discussed open-concept renovations and contemporary finishes while Evelyn stood at the sink washing a single cup and listened to them describe the space as though it had been waiting patiently for someone with real vision to arrive. "We'll take this wall out entirely," Claudia said, gesturing at the wall to her left, with the confidence of someone who has never needed to understand what a wall contains before deciding it should be removed. "Create a clean open plan. That's what the market responds to now." That wall contained behind its plaster a pipe that had burst twice in the 1990s and cost Edward $4,000 each time to repair. Evelyn had managed both repairs herself, hired the plumbers, supervised the work, arranged the temporary kitchen she had assembled in the dining room, so Edward's schedule would not be disrupted. She had the name of every plumber who had ever worked on any system in this house, written in a small address book she kept in the kitchen drawer. She did not mention the pipe. She washed her cup. She dried it. She put it away in the cabinet where it belonged. It was on the 11th day of those 30 that she heard the phone call. She was in the kitchen as she had been when the most significant things of her life had revealed themselves, the ordinary room where ordinary time passes and extraordinary things occasionally surface. Claudia was in the dining room close enough for her voice to carry with that particular penetrating clarity it always had. She was on her phone. Her tone was different from the performance voice she used in company, lower, more direct, stripped of the polished surface. The voice of someone speaking carefully about something important to someone they trusted with the important things. "We moved enough," Claudia was saying. 300,000 in the way we planned. By September, he was already declining enough that he couldn't track the paperwork properly. "Frank doesn't know about it. None of it is in the estate documentation." A pause. "Just make sure nothing surfaces anywhere. It's finished. We handled it correctly." Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink with both hands on the edge of the counter and listened until the voice stopped. She stood very still for a long moment, after that looking out the window at the garden, at the bare rose canes beginning to show the first tentative green at their tips. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out the small notebook she had bought at the Brookline Pharmacy 2 weeks ago and had been carrying since the morning of the will reading, because something, some instinct she could not name and did not question, had told her to begin keeping records of things. She wrote down the date. She wrote down what she had heard as precisely as she could remember it, word for word. She wrote down the time and the room and the fact that Claudia had not known she was in the kitchen. She put the notebook back in her pocket. She turned on the faucet and rinsed her hands and went back to what she had been doing, and when Claudia passed through the kitchen 20 minutes later, Evelyn looked up from the counter and offered a small, entirely neutral smile, and Claudia walked through without looking at her at all. On the 28th day, Evelyn packed 3 suitcases, 2 boxes. She moved through the rooms with the efficiency of someone who had already completed this process many times in her mind, who had already made every decision about what mattered and what had never been truly hers. The clothes that were hers by any reasonable accounting. A few books that had been hers before the marriage and had remained hers through it. The photographs from before her life became Edward's life, her parents a younger version of herself, in places she had briefly and freely inhabited. Letters her mother had written over the years in the careful cursive of a woman who believed that handwriting was a form of respect for the person receiving the words. That was it. 40 years in 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. She stood for a long time in the garden before she finished loading the car. The roses along the south wall were beginning to bud, those first tentative gestures that March roses make, testing whether warmth has truly committed to staying before committing themselves to growth. She had planted these roses from bare root stock she ordered from a nursery in Oregon the summer after she and Edward were married. She had read 3 books about rose cultivation before she touched the soil. She had made the beds herself by hand, kneeling in the dirt of that first optimistic spring. She stood among them and did not touch them. She looked at them for a long time. Then she turned and walked back to the house. Prescott arrived at 1:30, 15 minutes early to ensure she was actually leaving on time. She was already in her coat, her car already loaded, standing in the front hallway when he came through the door. He stopped when he saw her, surprised by the completeness of her readiness, the absence of any scene to manage. "The movers will be at 2, he said. "I'll make sure everything is handled properly." She looked at him for a moment. He was 60 years old, and he had his father's bone structure and his mother's eyes, and he had been unkind to her in 1,000 small and deliberate ways across 40 years, and he had never once examined that unkindness as something worthy of examination. "Prescott," she said. Her voice was quiet and steady and carried something she had not chosen to place there, but that had arrived on its own, the weight of 40 years given form as sound. "Do you understand what it costs a person to give 40 years of their life to a family and then be told in a legal document that will stand as the permanent record that they were domestic help?" He flushed. "Father left you a property. You're not receiving nothing." "Your father left me an address I've never heard of and 30 days to disappear from the only home I've known for 4 decades. She picked up her handbag from the hall table. "I hope the house sells well, Prescott." She walked past him to her car. She did not look back at the garden. She entered the address into her GPS 12, Whispering Pines Road, Millhaven, New Hampshire. 2 hours and 23 minutes. The iron key was on the passenger seat in its brown envelope. Beside it, the note in Edward's handwriting, refolded now along its original crease. She pulled out of the driveway of the Brookline house for the last time and drove north into the March afternoon toward a future that had the shape of a question she had not yet learned to ask properly. "Trust me one last time." She drove. The road into Millhaven, New Hampshire began as most roads in that part of New England begin as something ordinary. 2 lanes of state highway moving through open farmland, past stone walls that had been standing since before the Revolution, constructed by hands that had no name anymore. Past white farmhouses set back from the road, with their long barns attached against the cold in the practical New England fashion. Past fields that were still brown and flattened from winter, waiting with the patience of things that have waited before. Then the road narrowed. Then the farmland gave way to forest old growth, the kind that has been accumulating itself for centuries and has developed through that long accumulation a particular quality of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of fullness of a space so occupied by living things that sound moves through it differently, more carefully, as though the forest has opinions about what it allows to pass. The trees press close to the road on both sides, oak and maple and birch. Their branches still bare in the early spring cold, but dense enough overhead that the light changed, filtering through the interlocking branches into something softer and more considered than the ordinary afternoon light Evelyn had driven through for the past hour. She had been driving for just over 2 hours and 20 minutes. She had not turned on the radio. She had not called anyone because there was no one to call, and because silence felt on this particular drive like the appropriate condition. She had driven through Massachusetts and then into New Hampshire in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the 30 days she had just lived through. That quiet had been imposed, the silence of someone who has been made invisible. This quiet was chosen. She had noticed the difference somewhere around Concord and had sat with it for the remaining miles. The town of Millhaven appeared without warning. One moment she was in the forest, then a gap in the trees, a bend in the road, and there it was, a main street consisting of perhaps 12 or 15 buildings arranged around a small town square. A general store with a green painted facade and a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising the week's specials in careful block letters. A diner with red checkered curtains and a chalkboard menu visible from the street. A post office. A white church with a modest steeple that pointed upward with the unassuming conviction of something that had been pointing in the same direction for a very long time. A library that looked as though it had been built in the 1880s and had concluded in the intervening century and a half that it had made all the right decisions and saw no reason to reconsider any of them. It was exactly the small town that larger America had in many places let go of, and yet it did not have the feeling of having been let go. The buildings were maintained. The square had been recently swept. The window boxes, empty now in early March, had the look of things that would be full of flowers in June and fully intended to be. Evelyn drove slowly down Main Street, following the GPS as it directed her to turn left at the square. That was when she noticed. People were stopping. Not the reflexive pause of someone momentarily distracted by an unfamiliar car in a small town. Something different and more specific than that. The man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store stopped mid-motion and looked at her car with the focused attention of someone who has been expecting a particular thing and has just seen it arrive. A woman in the window of what appeared to be a small hardware store turned and watched Evelyn's car pass and nodded once to herself with the expression of someone confirming a thing they already knew to be true. Two older men on the wooden bench in front of the post office looked up from their conversations simultaneously and did not look away. Evelyn kept driving. She told herself it was what small towns did. She told herself it was nothing. She had followed the GPS's direction onto Whispering Pines Road and driven perhaps 200 yards into the trees when she heard footsteps behind her car, quick and purposeful on the dirt road. She glanced in the rearview mirror. A man was walking toward her from the direction of Main Street. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas work jacket and a Red Sox cap so long faded that the logo had become a suggestion rather than a clear image. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life needed to hurry because he owns the ground he walks on. Evelyn stopped the car and lowered the window. He reached her and stopped. He looked at her with steady gray eyes that held no hostility and no uncertainty, and nothing she could interpret as anything other than recognition. "Mrs. Wren," he said. It was not a question. Something shifted inside Evelyn's chest, small and quiet and seismic. He knew her name. This man she had never seen before in her life in a town she had never heard of until 3 weeks ago knew her name with the casual certainty of someone for whom it has always been a known thing. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Walt Pruitt. I run the general store back on Main." He gestured vaguely behind him with the ease of a man gesturing at something he owns. "Mr. Hargrove said you'd be coming. Said to watch for a woman named Evelyn Wren driving an older Honda, white." He glanced at the car with the brief, comprehensive assessment of a man who notices things as a professional habit. "He described you too. Said you'd look like someone who wasn't sure yet whether she was in the right place." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "Am I?" she said. "In the right place?" Walt Pruitt considered this with the seriousness it genuinely deserved. "I think that depends on what you were looking for when you left the waste one," he said. "But yes, ma'am, you're in the right place." He reached into the pocket of his work jacket and produced a paper bag, its top folded down in the way that booths from stores that have been packing groceries the same way since 1962 are always folded. "Bread, eggs, coffee, milk, some cheese. Figured you'd need supplies before anything else. House has been maintained, but there's no fresh food stocked." He handed it through the window. She took it automatically. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "Mr. Hargrove came here every month," she heard herself say, "for 40 years. "Every month without fail," Walt said. "More often sometimes when things were pressing on him. He talked about you every single time he came, constantly." He paused briefly. "Road's rough from here. Take it slow. The house is about a mile in. You'll know it when you see it." He touched the brim of his faded cap and turned and walked back toward Main Street. Without further ceremony, a man who had been asked to do something specific and had done it and considered the matter complete. Evelyn sat with the paper bag in her lap and the engine running and the forest very quiet around her, quiet in the full living way she had noticed when she'd entered the trees. Edward had talked about her, constantly, every single time. She put the car in drive and followed the road into the trees. She felt the clearing before she saw it, a change in the quality of the air, a sense of space opening after compression, the particular atmosphere that large clearings have when they are surrounded by dense forest. The road curved around a massive oak tree whose trunk was wider than her car, and then the forest fell back on both sides and the clearing appeared in front of her and Evelyn. Wren stopped the car and sat very still and looked at what was there. The house sat at the center of the clearing the way certain things sit in certain landscapes, as though they had always been there, as though they had grown from the ground rather than been placed upon it. It was built from gray field stone, 2 stories, the stone laid with the careful competence of someone who understood that the work would need to outlast them by several generations. A steep slate roof that caught the afternoon light and held it. White painted wooden trim around windows of old leaded glass, each pane slightly irregular, in the way that glass is when it has been made by hand, when its imperfections are the proof of its authenticity. A heavy oak door under a small covered portico with carved wooden supports. Simple carving, deliberate, the carving of someone who respected the material too much for unnecessary elaboration. Ivy growing up portions of the stone in the particular way that ivy grows when it has been shaped and directed over decades rather than simply allowed to spread the ivy of intention rather than the ivy of neglect. The grounds surrounding the house were overgrown in the way that formal gardens become overgrown when they have been loved but not consistently attended, not abandoned, not forgotten, but returned partially to something wilder than their original design. She could see the bones of it clearly. Stone pathways grassed over but still present beneath, still structuring the space if you knew how to read it. Rose beds along the south-facing wall, the canes long and arching, needing serious work but clearly healthy, clearly rooted deep in soil that had been properly prepared and properly maintained over time. What had once been a kitchen garden, raised beds gone to tangle at their edges, herbs that had run to wood and seed, but were still alive, still fundamentally present. And at the center of what had once been a formal garden area, a stone fountain, silent and dry, but beautiful in the way that only things with genuine age can be beautiful, carrying the weight of time as an aesthetic quality rather than a liability. Evelyn got out of the car. The air smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and something else she could not immediately name, something faintly sweet and earthy, the smell of soil that has been regularly worked and has become incrementally more alive through that regular working. The smell of a garden that has been cared for by someone who understood what they were doing. She walked to the front door. The iron key was already in her hand. She had taken it from the envelope without thinking, as though her body had arrived at the understanding before her mind did that this was the exact moment the key had been made for. She put it in the lock. It turned smoothly. With a precision that spoke of regular maintenance, the mechanism oiled and tended, kept in working condition, used regularly by someone who had been coming here for 40 years and had never let the house fall into the kind of disrepair that would make the returning harder. The door swung open on hinges that barely whispered. Evelyn Wren stepped across the threshold of 12 Whispering Pines Road, Millhaven, New Hampshire, and the house received her. The interior was warm. Not only the warmth of systems running, though the systems were running the heat low and steady and clearly prepared rather than incidental, but the warmth of a space that has been inhabited with care across a long span of years. The warmth that accumulates in rooms where someone has sat and thought and been present in the particular way that leaves a residue of intention in the air and the walls and the very quality of light that moves through a space. The main floor was largely open walls between original rooms, removed at some point in the past with the care of someone who wanted the space without losing the character. Wide plank floors of old pine burnished to a deep gold by decades of foot traffic and regular maintenance glowing in the late afternoon light. A massive stone fireplace dominating the north wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak in a repeating pattern of leaves and acorns, simple and precise, the work of a craftsman who understood restraint. Built-in bookshelves running the full length of one wall filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines showed the particular fading of books that have been read rather than collected. The furniture was simple and clearly made to last, a deep leather sofa worn at the arms in the way leather wears when it has been properly used across many years. Several chairs positioned to take the best advantage of the light from the leaded glass windows. A round table of old walnut near the kitchen doorway. Evelyn saw all of this in her peripheral awareness, because what commanded her full attention, what held it absolutely and completely, was the walls. Every wall, every available surface, every shelf not occupied by books. Photographs, dozens of them, more than dozens, framed carefully arranged with evident thought and evident purpose, covering the walls with the comprehensiveness of a gallery that has been assembled over a very long time by someone who knew exactly what they were building. Photographs of Evelyn. She walked closer to the nearest wall and looked at them one by one. Her wedding day, 1984, young and full of a hope she had not yet learned the full cost of standing in a garden she could not immediately place. The Brookline garden years later, kneeling in the soil with dirt on her gardening gloves, and an expression on her face she had almost forgotten she was capable of pure and complicated pleasure in the work of her hands. A candid shot from somewhere she did not remember being photographed, laughing at something, her head thrown back completely unguarded. A photograph taken on what appeared to be the porch of this very house. She was asleep in a wooden chair, her head tilted slightly, afternoon sun on her face, peaceful in a way that seemed to belong to a life she had not known she was living. She had never seen these photographs. She had never known they were being taken. She moved through the room slowly from wall to wall, taking each one in. Here she was in the Brookline house on a winter morning, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow, a cup of coffee held in both hands, unaware of the camera. Here she was at a community event, talking to someone whose face was turned away from the lens, her own face animated and interested, more genuinely present than she usually felt at those occasions. Here she was reading in the garden, the afternoon light making her white hair luminous, her feet tucked beneath her in the garden chair. Here she was at different ages, in different seasons, in different unguarded moments, documented across 40 years by a man who had brought each photograph here and placed it on a wall in a house she had never visited. She stood in the center of the room. She had not cried at the hospital. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried at the will reading. She had held herself together through 30 days of being made invisible in her own home with the discipline of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to keep her interior weather entirely private. She cried now. She stood in the room full of photographs of herself and put her face in her hands and cried in a way she had not cried since she was very young, since before the life she had chosen had required this particular form of composure from her. She cried until her shoulders shook and her chest ached, and the tears ran through all their available volume, and when they were done, she was left standing in a quiet that felt different from any quiet she had been in before. Not emptiness, not the numbness of the past month, something that had weight and temperature and felt tentatively but unmistakably like the beginning of understanding something she had needed to understand for a long time. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the walls again. He had loved her. Whatever else was true, whatever failures and silences and locked doors and maintained distances and monthly trips explained only partially had constituted their 40 years together, he had loved her. This room was not the product of anything else. This room was the product of a man who had kept a secret for 4 decades because the secret was the most true thing about him. She found the study beneath the staircase. A door set flush with the paneling easy to miss if you were not looking, if you were not the kind of person who noticed things. She opened it and found a room 10 feet by 12 windowless, lined on 3 walls from floor to ceiling, with built-in shelves. On those shelves, arranged in the systematic order of a man who had spent his professional life managing documents and had never lost the habit, were rows of files, folders, binders, document boxes, all labeled in Edward's distinctive, precise handwriting. Against the fourth wall, a mahogany desk with a green-shaded banker's lamp. A leather chair that had been sat in so many times across so many years that it had taken on the shape of the man who had occupied it, the permanent impression of a person who had been present in this room consistently, thoughtfully for a very long time. And at the center of the desk, positioned with clear and deliberate intent, a thick cream envelope. The wax seal was dark red. The writing on the front was Edward's slightly less controlled than his usual hand, the hand of someone who had written this in a moment of feeling rather than professional execution. To my Evelyn, my most beloved. She sat in his chair. She broke the seal. She unfolded 5 pages of Edward's careful handwriting and began to read. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, you found the house, which means you trusted me one last time, and I am more grateful for that trust than I have any right to be. I need to explain everything from the beginning because you deserve the complete truth, and I was in life too much of a coward to give it to you when giving it properly would have cost me something. In June of 1984, 3 months after our wedding, my uncle Thomas Hargrove died. Thomas was the quiet one in the family, a bachelor, a man who lived simply despite having considerable means, who spent his life studying local history and tending a piece of land he had loved since he was young. He left this property to me, but he left it with a condition written into his personal letter rather than the legal documents, because he understood that the legal documents would be read by lawyers and the personal letter would be read by me. He wrote, "Protect this place for someone you love more than your own life. It deserves to shelter love, not be used as leverage. I had been married to you for 3 months. I already knew. I knew what you were willing to give. I knew what kind of woman had agreed to build a life with me, despite everything. I came with the children who had decided before they met you that they would resent you, the professional reputation that required constant performance, the personal distance that I had been maintaining for so long. It had become simply my way of being in the world. I knew in 3 months that you were the best thing that had ever happened to me, and I knew with the particular clarity that comes from 5 decades of legal practice and watching how families behave when money is involved exactly what my children were capable of if they understood what I was doing. So I protected you the only way I knew how. In 1986, 2 years after our wedding, when I was certain in the way a man is certain of very few things in his life, I had the property transferred into your name alone. A gift documented as such, structured and witnessed in a manner that predates any argument about marital property. My attorneys reviewed the structure carefully. I have reviewed it myself every 5 years since. No court will successfully challenge your ownership of this property. The deed is clean. The gift documentation is thorough. The trust that covers all property expenses for the next 50 years is separately structured and already funded. Prescott will try, Claudia will push him, Brett will follow because he has never in his life initiated anything himself. They will hire expensive lawyers and make noise. Do not be afraid of the noise. The house sits on 247 acres of protected woodland. Conservation organizations have already expressed serious interest in the land at a value of approximately $3.2 million. That decision is entirely yours. The house itself as a historical structure carries a separate assessment of approximately $800,000. What you do with any of it is your choice entirely. I also need you to understand what I gave the children and why. The Brookline house is mortgaged significantly. I took a substantial loan against it 18 months ago, which they are now responsible for. The historical preservation easements I placed on it years ago will make any rapid sale essentially impossible, and any significant renovation prohibitively complicated to execute legally. They wanted the mansion. I gave them the mansion, along with everything the mansion will cost them. The trusts are structured to reward behavior they have never demonstrated and to become unworkable if they continue as they always have. Prescott must maintain employment and pass annual ethics evaluations conducted by Harold Bryce. I suspect you know that name even from outside the profession. Claudia must demonstrate stable family relationships on criteria she cannot meet. Brett must actively manage his own investments quarterly or watch them dissolve into charitable distribution. I designed each condition knowing precisely what each of them would encounter. I gave them the performance. I gave you everything real. There is a third cabinet in the study. You need to see what is there before you do anything else because what it contains may become necessary, and you need to know it exists. Everything in those files was gathered in the legitimate course of 5 decades of legal practice. I never used any of it. Using it would have been wrong, and whatever my other failures, I was not willing to be that kind of attorney. But I documented everything because information in the law is the closest available approximation to safety. Those files are yours now. They are insurance. I hope you never need them. I am sorry for the language in the will. The words domestic services were chosen deliberately to give Prescott and Claudia exactly what they wanted to read, to make them believe they had won, to make them stop looking further. I needed them to stop looking. Please know that I never, not for a single day of our 40 years, thought of what you gave me as anything other than the most significant gift of my life. I failed you in the ways that mattered most. I failed to stand beside you publicly when standing would have cost me the peace I had been maintaining at your expense. I failed to silence my children when their unkindness was visible to everyone, and I pretended not to see it. I told myself I was protecting the structure of our life, maintaining a stability that served everyone. The truth is, I was afraid of conflict, and I chose my comfort over your dignity, and there is no honest defense for that. I hope this house is some measure of repair for that failure. I hope you will live in it and fill it with whatever brings you genuine pleasure and make it into something that is entirely and unmistakably yours in the way the Brookline house never was. I loved you more than I ever managed to say while I was breathing. I love you still. Forever yours, Edward. She read the letter through once without stopping. Then she began again from the first line and read it more slowly, pausing at certain sentences and sitting with them before continuing. When she finally set it down on the desk and looked up at the shelves surrounding her, the decades of careful documentation, the ordered files that represented 40 years of a man maintaining the discipline of his professional life in service of a plan he had made and never wavered from, She sat for a long time in the silence of the study. Then she stood and opened the third cabinet. What she found there required nearly an hour to move through with appropriate care. The first section contained the property documents. The deed to 12 Whispering Pines Road transferred to Evelyn Ann Wren in March of 1986. The trust documentation comprehensive, clearly drafted, structured with the thoroughness of someone who had anticipated every possible challenge and prepared a response. The conservation assessment dated the previous spring, the historical structure evaluation. She read each document with the careful attention she had developed across 4 decades of managing a household that included an attorney's professional paperwork. She was not a lawyer, but she had spent 40 years in close proximity to legal thinking, and she understood enough to recognize as she read that Edward had been right. This was clean. This was the work of a man who had spent 50 years anticipating challenges and removing them before they could develop into problems. She closed the first section and opened the second. The trust documents for Prescott, Claudia, and Brett were arranged in separate folders, each dense with the specific interlocking conditions Edward's letter had described. She read through Prescott's first, the annual increments, the employment verification, the ethics evaluation to be conducted by Harold Bryce, a name she recognized even from outside the profession, a retired judge whose reputation in the Massachusetts legal community for uncompromising ethical standards was the kind of reputation that is built from decades of decisions that cost the person making them something. Prescott's character would be evaluated annually by a man who had censured sitting attorneys for conduct far less problematic than the one Prescott engaged in as ordinary business. Claudia's conditions were more precisely constructed and more specifically impossible. The family stability requirement referenced metrics that could only be evaluated by someone who knew the actual state of Claudia's relationships. 3 divorces, children who had stopped speaking to her. She pulled Claudia's folder and opened it. The financial documentation inside was meticulous: transaction records, correspondence, dates and amounts, and account numbers cross-referenced and annotated in Edward's hand with the precision of someone who had been building a case with the patience of a man who knew he would not be there to present it himself. And at the back of the folder behind the last document, a set of bank wire transfer records. Confirmations of the movement of funds from accounts in Edward's name to accounts she did not recognize, dated across a period of 3 months in the autumn before his death. September. $300,000 moved in 3 separate transfers across 6 weeks. And attached to the final confirmation page with a paperclip, a single handwritten note. The handwriting was shakier than Edward's usual script, the writing of a man whose fine motor control had already begun to decline, but the words were legible and more than legible, entirely clear in their meaning. She thinks I don't understand the paperwork anymore. She is wrong about that. Evelyn read the note twice. She looked at the transfer records. She looked at the note again. He had known. He had been watching it happen. He had documented it precisely and methodically, even as his hands shook and his cognitive clarity came and went, because the documentation was the point. The documentation was the weapon he was leaving for the person who would need it after he was gone. She took the small notebook from her cardigan pocket. She opened it to the page where she had recorded Claudia's phone call, the date, the time, the words as precisely as she could remember them. She read what she had written. She looked at the transfer records in Edward's file. She looked at the note. 2 sources. Her own direct observation of Claudia's phone call. Edward's documented record of the transactions themselves annotated in his own hand while he still understood what he was looking at before he chose to let them believe he no longer did. She put both documents back and closed the cabinet. She sat in the chair that still held faintly the shape of the man who was gone. She looked at the walls of files surrounding her. 40 years of careful, patient, deliberate construction. A plan so thorough that it had required 40 years to execute properly and had not wavered in that time. She thought about the word he had used in the letter: insurance. She thought about the 3 people who would eventually appear on the road outside this house because she knew they would come. She had been married to Edward Hargrove for 40 years, and she had observed his children operate with the certainty of people who have never encountered an obstacle they could not remove through money or pressure or sheer persistent aggression. They would come because they could not help themselves, because the house was worth more than they had expected, and because they were constitutionally unable to leave worth They believed they deserved unchallenged. She thought about what she would say when they arrived. She opened the desk drawer and found a notepad, Edward's name embossed at the top, his standard stationery. She found a pen. She uncapped it and began to write in her careful and unhurried hand a list. Not of fears, not of what had been taken, not of what 40 years of silence had cost her. A list of what she had: the property, the deed, the trust structure, the conservation assessment, the 3 folders in the 3rd cabinet, the transfer records in Claudia's folder, and Edward's annotated note, the notebook in her cardigan pocket with her own first-hand record, the full 5-page letter from a man who had spent 40 years building a fortress and had left her both the keys and the complete map of every room. She wrote it all down. She looked at what she had written when she was finished. She sat in Edward's chair in the windowless study, surrounded by the evidence of a love she had not known how to read while it was happening, and she felt for the first time since the morning she had walked into a bedroom, carrying a cup of coffee that was still hot, she felt ready. That evening, she walked through the house as the light changed, room by room, taking the time the house deserved. The kitchen was a combination of the historical and the functional, an antique wood stove standing alongside modern appliances that someone had installed with care not to overwhelm the older character of the space. Copper pots on wall hooks, a farmhouse sink deep enough to be genuinely useful. Open shelves holding plain white ironstone dishes that had the satisfying weight of things made to last rather than to impress. The dining room held a long oak table, 12 chairs, the surface clean and clear, the wood showing the marks of years of honest use. Edward had sat alone at this bowl every month for 40 years, and she tried to hold that image clearly in her mind and found she could not quite find all its edges. He had sat here and looked at the walls in the adjacent room, covered with photographs of a woman living her life in Boston, and she did not know the precise name of what he had felt, but she knew it was not nothing. She knew it was not close to nothing. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. The largest had windows overlooking the clearing and the forest beyond, and more photographs of Evelyn on the walls. These ones different in character from those downstairs, closer and more personal. The photographs of someone who was not performing documentation but simply watching someone he loved move through an ordinary day. A photograph of her, sleeping morning light soft on her face. A photograph of her in the garden, looking up suddenly as though she had heard something caught mid-motion, her expression open and unguarded. She stood at the window of the master bedroom and looked out at the clearing in the last light of the March afternoon. The stone fountain at the center of the old garden was dry and still, its basin holding a thin layer of fallen leaves from the previous autumn. But the stone was clean. Moss had grown over portions of the base in a way that was beautiful rather than neglected, the way age is beautiful when the thing it has aged has been maintained. The call from Frank Delacroix came on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Evelyn arrived in Millhaven. She was in the garden when her phone rang, kneeling in the cold soil of the old kitchen bed with a pair of pruning shears she had found hanging in the small tool room off the back of the house. She was working at the woody base of what had once been a substantial rosemary plant and would be again given the right attention at the right time. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of March morning in New Hampshire that acknowledges winter has not conceded, while demonstrating that it is at least willing to discuss terms. Her hands were dirty, her knees were damp through her work trousers. She had been outside since 7 and had not once thought about Boston. She pulled off her right glove and answered. "Evelyn?" Frank's voice had its careful quality, the sound of a man selecting his words with professional precision while carrying something that his professional training could not entirely contain. "I hope you're settling in." "I am," she said, a brief pause. "I need to give you some advance notice. Prescott contacted me yesterday. He's retained attorneys 3 from Whitmore and Graves." He said the firm name in a way that communicated its significance efficiently. Whitmore and Graves was the kind of firm that appeared in newspaper coverage of major estate litigation and in conversations among Boston's legal community as a reliable shorthand for expensive, aggressive, and effective. They're filing a motion to have the Millhaven property reclassified as marital property subject to division. Evelyn looked at the rosemary plant in front of her. The woody base was thick and gnarled, the accumulation of years without proper cutting back. But the roots were deep. She could tell from the resistance the plant offered when she pressed the soil around it. Whatever happened above ground, the roots had been going deeper the entire time. "On what grounds?" she said. They're arguing that any property of significant value acquired during a marriage constitutes a marital asset, regardless of how title was structured. They'll challenge the 1986 gift documentation. They'll argue Edward lacked independent legal counsel necessary for a valid gift transfer of this magnitude. They'll make it complicated and expensive, and they'll count on you not having the resources or the stamina to fight it through a full litigation. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Frank," she said, "did you help Edward structure the 1986 transfer?" A brief pause on his end. "I did." "And were you acting as independent counsel for that transaction, separate from your role as Edward's general attorney of record?" The documentation reflects exactly that. Edward was very specific about how it needed to be structured from the beginning. He told me when we did the transfer that he anticipated it would eventually be challenged. "Then let them file," Evelyn said. "I have everything I need." There was a quality to the silence on Frank's end that she could hear clearly, not surprise exactly, but the sound of a man revising his estimate of someone in a significant upward direction. Evelyn Whitmore and Graves. "I know who they are, Frank. I was married to an attorney for 40 years. She picked up her pruning shears and looked at the rosemary. "Edward left me very thorough documentation and some additional materials I don't believe Prescott's attorneys are aware exist. I'll be fine." She thanked him. She ended the call. She put her glove back on and went back to work. The town of Millhaven did not arrive all at once. It came gradually, the way good things tend to arrive, without announcement, accumulating around her in layers that each added something without demanding anything in return. Walt Pruitt's general store became a daily stop, not because she needed supplies every day, but because the store functioned the way certain places in small towns function as social infrastructure, as the place where information moves and community maintains itself through small, regular transactions of conversation and acknowledgement. Walt was not a man who talked to fill silence. He talked when he had something worth saying, which made everything he said worth hearing. He told her about Edward in pieces offered over several mornings at the 3 stools along the front window, with coffee refilled from the pot behind the counter without being asked. "He'd come in first thing every visit," Walt said one morning. "First stop in town without exception for as long as I can remember. We'd talk for an hour, sometimes more, if neither of us had pressing business. He wasn't like I imagine he was in Boston." He considered the surface of the counter for a moment. No performance to him here. He'd sit and talk like someone who just wanted to talk, like a person who had other places where that wasn't possible and valued the places where it was. Evelyn looked up from her coffee. What did he talk about? History of the county. He knew a great deal about that, more than most. The law occasionally, but not in the way you'd expect. He talked about what the law was supposed to do versus what it actually did. He talked about the library, about the church roof when that needed attention. Walt paused. He talked about rose bushes, more than you'd expect from a Boston attorney. Rose bushes. He asked me once what the best winter protection was for hybrid teas in this climate. Said he was maintaining some for someone who couldn't get there to do it herself. Walt considered this. I told him burlap, and he said he'd already been using burlap for years, but wondered if there was something better. We spent 20 minutes on it. He knew your garden in Brookline in considerable detail. What you'd planted, where what was doing well and what was struggling. He looked at her. He paid attention to what you did, Mrs. Wren. He just paid it in a place you couldn't see. She thought about burlap-wrapped rose canes in a garden she had never visited, maintained by a man who had never once mentioned to her that he knew what burlap was for. Constance Patterson lived 3 houses from the library in a yellow clapboard house with a porch that caught the afternoon sun. She was in her late 70s, small and deliberate in her movements, with the particular quality of alertness that belongs to people who have paid careful attention to things their whole lives and intend to continue. She brought Evelyn a blueberry pie on the 4th day and sat at the kitchen table with tea and spoke about Edward with the directness of someone who had decided exactly what she wanted to say and was saying it. "My grandson Caleb needed college, and there was no money for it," she said. Then a letter arrived from a scholarship trust for students from Grafton County. Full tuition, 4 years anonymous. We figured out eventually who it was, the timing, the structure of the paperwork, the way the language was constructed. Edward's fingerprints were on it if you knew how to read legal language, which I don't, but my daughter-in-law does. She picked up her cup. Caleb is a structural engineer now working in Portland. First college degree in our family in 3 generations. That degree came from Edward Hargrove, sitting in this town once a month for 40 years and deciding that things here mattered. Sarah Oakes, the librarian, was 29 and had the energy of someone who had found exactly the work that was right for them and felt the particular good fortune of that every day. She met Evelyn at the library door one morning when Evelyn had walked over to explore the local history section, which was, she discovered, immediately remarkable in its depth and breadth for an institution of this size. Mr. Hargrove built this collection, Sarah said, moving along the shelves with the proprietary affection of a curator describing something she has been entrusted with. 5,000 books across about 15 years. He'd arrive with boxes, sometimes just show up with a truck and say he'd found things he thought we should have. The county historical materials alone required a dedicated wing. He funded the wing too. She shook her head slightly. He said a town without books wasn't really a town at all. Those are his exact words, Evelyn said. Sarah looked at her. He said them to you? No, Evelyn said, but I think I knew that about him. I knew that was the kind of thing he thought even if I never heard him say it. She was beginning to understand something she should perhaps have understood earlier. She had known more about Edward than she had realized, not the facts, not the trips in the house, and the decades of anonymous generosity in a town 3 states away, but the person beneath the facts. The man who cared about rose cultivation and a library's collection and the educational futures of children he had no legal obligation to, and the proper maintenance of a church roof because a congregation deserves shelter. That person she had glimpsed occasionally and briefly through the complete and maintained surface of their Boston life. She had glimpsed him and not fully understood what she was seeing. Here he had been able to be that person without the architecture of expectation that his professional reputation and his children's demands and 50 years of being Edward Hargrove of Hargrove and Associates had constructed around him. Here he had been a man who talked to Walt Pruitt about burlap and paid tuition anonymously and wanted the library to have what it needed. Here he had been the man he might have been if the first marriage had not happened or had ended before it built the resentments it built, if the children had not arrived already armed against anyone who might displace their mother's claim on their father's loyalty. He had come here once a month for 40 years and been himself. And he had kept Evelyn's photographs on the walls of this house because she was the one other place, the one other person where he had been able to be himself, at least in the privacy of his own heart, even when the circumstances of their shared life had not allowed him to demonstrate it in any way she could see. She understood him more clearly now than she had at any point in 40 years of marriage. She sat with that understanding for several days, turning it over, carefully examining it from different angles. She was not entirely sure whether to find it comforting or devastating. She decided after sufficient consideration that it was both and that both was the accurate answer and that she could live with accuracy. Prescott's Mercedes appeared on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival coming up. Whispering pines rode through the trees with the careful pace of an expensive car whose driver is protecting its undercarriage on a dirt surface it was not designed for. She heard the engine from inside the house and went to the upstairs window and watched the car park at the edge of the clearing. All 3 of them got out. Prescott first in a coat too precisely tailored for rural New Hampshire, his expression moving through several distinct phases as he took in the house. The confident assessment of a man who has been told a property is worth contesting, then the recalibration of someone whose eyes are delivering information his expectations had not prepared him for, then the particular tightening around the jaw of a person who realizes in a single clear moment that they have underestimated something important. Claudia beside him in dark glasses, despite the overcast sky, her posture carrying the specific message that she was present under conditions she found beneath her and intended to resolve the situation efficiently. She looked at the house with an expression that was performing neutrality over something more complicated moving underneath. Brett behind them, both his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the clearing and the fountain and the forest at its edges, with an expression that was different from his siblings. Not calculation, something closer to a long-held unease, finally given a specific object. He was 56 years old, and he had the look of a man who has spent his entire adult life following the people in front of him without fully examining where they were leading, and who is now, perhaps for the first time, asking the question. Evelyn came downstairs. She put the kettle on. She arranged 3 cups on the kitchen counter, with care using the good white ironstone cups. She waited for the knock. She opened the door before they finished knocking, and she stood in the doorway the way a person stands in the doorway of their own house, fully occupying the space without the slight accommodating forward lean she had developed across decades of making herself physically smaller, in rooms where she had been made to feel she did not have the full right to take up space. She filled the doorway. She watched them absorb this. She watched them absorb the house behind her. "Prescott," she said pleasantly. "Claudia, Brett, please come in." She led them to the main room and gestured toward the seating and went to the kitchen for the tea. She did not hurry. She poured with care, arranged the cups on a tray with a small pitcher of milk and a bowl of the sugar cubes she had found in the pantry, the ones in the blue box that had an old-fashioned formality she had come to appreciate. She carried the tray in and set it on the low table and sat across from them and poured. The photographs were on all the walls around them. She did not explain the photographs. She simply allowed the room to be exactly what it was. Prescott cleared his throat with the manner of a man executing the opening of a rehearsed conversation. "Evelyn, we've come because we believe there are things that need to be addressed directly without attorneys if that can be managed." "That's considerate of you," Evelyn said. "We've had the property assessed." His voice had its professional register, now measured confident, the register he used when he wanted to communicate command of relevant information. "The value is considerably higher than was represented in Father's estate documents. The land alone, given its size and conservation potential, represents a significant asset by any measure. Our position, and our attorneys concur, is that a property of this value acquired during a marriage should properly be subject to standard marital asset provisions." "The property was not acquired during our marriage," Evelyn said. Not sharply, not defensively, simply and precisely the statement of a person who has the facts and is stating them. "It was transferred into my name in March of 1986 as a gift from your father to me personally. That transfer predates any marital property argument by 4 decades. The documentation is complete, independently witnessed, and has been reviewed by your father's legal team at 5-year intervals to ensure it remains unassailable." She reached to the side of her chair and lifted a folder she had placed there before they arrived. She set it on the table between them. "That is a complete copy of the primary documents. Your attorneys at Whitmore and Graves should review them before investing further time in a motion that will be dismissed." Claudia's jaw shifted slightly, the movement of a person revising calculations mid-conversation. "We're not speaking only to the technical legal structure," Claudia said, taking over with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to the handoff. "We're speaking to the spirit of what Father intended. Whatever the documentation establishes, technically, it doesn't seem appropriate that you would receive assets of this scale while your father's children received $8.7 million in estate assets," Evelyn said. "Or they received the legal structure of $8.7 million, which is a meaningfully different thing, as I expect you are beginning to discover." A pause. Brett had not spoken. He was looking at the photographs on the wall to his left, specifically at a photograph of Evelyn in the Brookline garden, kneeling in the working position she used for serious planting, both hands in the soil, her face turned slightly upward toward the light. "That's our garden," Brett said, not aggressively, with a kind of careful uncertainty, as though he was saying something he had not previously been sure how to say. "The Brookline garden. It's a photograph of me in the Brookline garden, yes," Evelyn said. She looked at Brett directly, which she had not done yet since they sat down. "Your father took it. He took all of them." She let that settle for a moment. "Every photograph in this house was taken by your father over the course of our marriage, brought here by him, and arranged on these walls by him. He did this across 40 years of monthly visits, alone, each time he came." She waited. "Make of that what you will." Brett looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands. Prescott set his cup on the tray with a precision that communicated controlled impatience. "Evelyn, we came here in good faith. Then let's proceed in good faith, Evelyn said. She stood. She walked to the study door and came back with 3 white envelopes, each one with a name written on the front, in her careful, unhurried handwriting. She had prepared them the previous evening at Edward's desk in the lamplight. She had slept well afterward. She placed 1 envelope in front of each of them. Prescott. She sat back down and looked at him steadily. Your envelope contains a detailed summary of the trust your father established for you. I would direct your particular attention to the annual ethics evaluation provisions and to the name of the independent trustee your father selected to conduct those evaluations. She waited 1 beat. Harold Bryce. Something small and involuntary happened to the corners of Prescott's eyes. Claudia. Evelyn turned to her. Your envelope contains 2 things. The first is your trust summary, including the family stability requirements with their specific evaluative criteria. The second is documentation. Claudia's hand moved to the envelope but did not open it. Your father maintained meticulous financial records for the entirety of his career. The records from September of last year are particularly thorough. 3 transfers across 6 weeks totaling $300,000 from accounts in your father's name to accounts connected to you, all executed during the period of his cognitive decline. Evelyn's voice remained entirely level. Your father annotated those records himself by hand. The note he left with the final transfer documentation is brief. He wrote, "She thinks I don't understand the paperwork anymore. She is wrong about that." The room was very quiet. The antique clock on the mantel ticked with the unhurried consistency of something that has been keeping time in this room for a very long time and intends to continue doing so indefinitely. Those transactions would constitute financial elder abuse under Massachusetts law, Evelyn said. They would also constitute fraud against the estate. Frank Delacroix, as executor, would be legally obligated to act if the information were brought to his attention. The IRS would have questions as well, given that the transfers do not appear in any estate documentation. Claudia sat very still. Her composure was entirely intact, which told Evelyn more about what it was costing her to maintain it than any visible crack would have. Brett. Evelyn looked at the youngest of the 3 Hargrove children and found something in his face that was not present in either of his siblings. Not guilt precisely, something older and more exhausted than guilt. The exhaustion of a man who has spent 56 years following other people's choices and is now sitting in a room that is making him wonder quietly and, for the first time with any seriousness, what his own choices would have looked like. Your trust requires active, hands-on management of your investment portfolio verified quarterly. If that requirement is not met, the portfolio dissolves and the full value goes to a charitable foundation selected by the trustee. She looked at him gently. I'm not saying that to threaten you. I'm saying it because you deserve to know what you're actually working with before Prescott decides what the 3 of you are going to do. Brett opened his envelope. He read it carefully in the way of someone reading something they already know on some level, for whom the reading is the formal acknowledgement of what they have been for some time choosing not to see fully. You're threatening us, Claudia said. Her voice had gone very precise and very quiet, the voice of someone whose composure is an act of concentrated will. No, Evelyn said. I am describing the situation as it actually exists. Your father described the situation as it actually exists in documents he spent 40 years preparing and left to me because he knew this conversation would happen and he wanted me to be equipped for it. She looked at Claudia without hostility and without warmth, with the level, unperformed attention of a woman who has nothing left to demonstrate and nothing left to protect except the truth. He also did something else in the way he structured this estate. He spent 40 years being unable to stand beside me publicly, unable to choose my dignity over his desire to avoid conflict. In the structure of this will, he finally made that choice. For the first time. He did it in the only way still available to him. She paused. He did it for me. She let that sit in the room for the time it needed. Here's what I am offering, she said. One offer stated once not subject to negotiation or revision. You withdraw the Whitmore and Graves motion. You accept the estate as written and live with the trust your father designed and the Brookline house and whatever you can make of those things going forward. In return, the contents of those envelopes, every piece of it, including the transfer documentation and your father's annotated note remain in this house, permanently. No courts beyond what's already in motion, no IRS referral, no estate fraud investigation, no disclosure of any kind. She looked from Prescott to Claudia to Brett in turn. That is a considerably better outcome than the alternative, and I would encourage you to discuss it among yourselves with that clearly in mind. Prescott's face had become the face of a man running a complex calculation. She could almost see the components of it moving the legal exposure against the cost of litigation, the professional reputation in a city where Edward Hargrove had been a known figure for 50 years, and where Prescott's own career operated in that shadow, the Harold Bryce factor, the particular attention that estate fraud investigations attract. Claudia was motionless, her composure held but held the way things hold under significant load by concentration, not by nature. Brett was still reading his envelope. "We'll need to discuss this privately," Prescott said finally. "Of course," Evelyn said. She picked up her tea. "Take whatever time you need, but before you do this, property is mine. It has been mine since your father transferred it in 1986 because he made it mine with the same precision and thoroughness he brought to everything he built across 50 years of practice. What he left you was considerable, even with the conditions in the mortgage and the preservation requirements. What he left me was a home." She set her cup down with the quiet finality of someone placing a period at the end of a sentence. "I intend to keep it." They left 20 minutes later, getting into the Mercedes with the careful movements of people managing their dignity through conscious effort. Prescott opened Claudia's door for her, a courtesy he had certainly not offered in ordinary circumstances. Brett got in last. He paused before closing his door and looked back at the house at Evelyn standing on the stone steps, and he nodded once. A small private acknowledgement she could not entirely interpret, but that felt in its quality like an apology not for any specific thing, but for the general accumulation of things. For 40 years of being the third voice in a chorus that had never required his individual contribution, because it required only his compliance. She nodded back. The Mercedes turned slowly on the dirt road and moved back through the trees. She stood on the steps and listened until the engine sound had faded completely into the forest, and there was only the forest's own silence. Then she went inside and sat in the leather chair by the stone fireplace and allowed herself quietly and without performance to feel the full weight of what had happened and what it meant. The motion from Whitmore and Graves was withdrawn within 72 hours. Frank Delacroix called her on a Tuesday morning to confirm, his voice carrying a warmth that was professional and genuine in equal measure. "I don't need to know what was said at that meeting," he told her. "No," she agreed, "you don't." A brief pause. "Edward would be pleased," he said, "for whatever that is worth." She considered it honestly. "I think Edward would be relieved," she said. "He spent 40 years worrying about whether this would hold. He can stop now." Spring came to Millhaven with the decisiveness that spring has in northern New England when it finally stops negotiating. Not gradual, not tentative, but committed, a turn from gray to color that happens across 2 weeks and transforms everything it touches. Evelyn had engaged 2 young men from town to help with the heavy work in the garden, the removal of dead wood accumulated over years of incomplete maintenance, the regrading of the stone pathways, the clearing of the kitchen beds that had gone entirely to tangle at their edges. But the planting she did herself. That was not a point she was willing to concede. She had spent 40 years making things grow, and she was not about to begin the next chapter of her life by handing the most essentially hers part of the work to someone else. She started with the roses. The canes along the south-facing wall were long and arching and needed serious cutting, the kind of cutting that looks to anyone who does not understand roses like destruction, like the removal of the very thing you are trying to preserve. She knew better. She had known for 30 years that cutting back hard in early spring is not destruction, but preparation, the removal of what is exhausted and spent to make room for what is still capable of growth. She worked her way along the wall with her pruning shears, cutting back to the strong wood to the nodes where new growth was already showing green beneath the dead cane, and as she worked, she thought about the years these roses had been tended in her absence. Not perfectly. She could see that in the way the canes had been allowed to get ahead of themselves, the way certain beds had been left when they should have been attended. But tended. Consistently and persistently tended across 40 years of monthly visits by a man who had learned about burlap from Walt Pruitt and had learned the pruning from somewhere, perhaps from the same book she had used in the early years in Brookline, because the plants, despite their wildness, were fundamentally sound. The root systems were deep and healthy. Whatever had happened above the soil, the roots had been kept going. She worked for 2 hours on the south wall before she sat back on her heels in the March soil. He had kept the roses alive. He had kept the roots deep. He had done it imperfectly, without the confidence that comes from real long-term experience, without the instinct that develops over decades of hands in the soil work. But he had done it month after month for 40 years because the roses were hers, because she had planted them in another garden, in another life, and because whatever else was true or not true about what they were to each other, he had never been able to stop caring about the things she cared about, even in a garden she had never visited. She found this to be the thing that broke her open most completely. More than the photographs covering every wall, more than the 5-page letter, more than the trust documents in the careful legal architecture, and the 40 years of patient, thorough, entirely private strategic construction. The roses. The simple, imperfect, persistent monthly tending of the roses. She sat in the cold March soil and felt something release in her chest that had been held there for a long time. Not grief and not anger, but the deep foundational thing that lives beneath both of those, the thing that had been waiting all these years for permission to be acknowledged. She had been loved. Imperfectly. Inadequately. Privately. With 1,000 failures of courage and public silence, she had deserved better than. But she had been loved completely, with the kind of completeness that does not leave room for anything else to occupy the same space. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went back to work. 6 months after arriving in Millhaven on an early September morning, when the first suggestion of autumn was present in the air, and the highest branches of the oaks at the clearing's edge were beginning to show the first tentative color at their tips, Evelyn found the second envelope. She was reorganizing the study. The room had become hers in the way the garden had become hers, the place where she spent time that felt chosen rather than required, where the choosing itself was the point. She had been keeping her own files there for months, her correspondence with the conservation organizations whose interest in the land had become increasingly specific and serious. Her garden notes, her correspondence with a structural engineer Sarah Oakes had recommended, who was helping her assess which elements of the house's historical fabric could be preserved and which needed attention. She was going through the contents of the bottom drawer of Edward's desk, the one she had not fully explored in those first overwhelming weeks, when her hand found it at the very back. A plain white envelope, not sealed. Her name on the front in Edward's handwriting, and beneath the name in smaller letters, "For your future. Open when you are ready." She sat with it for a moment. She knew she was ready. She had probably known for several weeks. She had not gone looking because she understood instinctively and without needing to examine the instinct that certain things present themselves in their own time, and that the right moment for an encounter is the moment it arrives rather than the moment you force it. She opened it. Inside, a property deed, 20 acres at the eastern edge of Millhaven bordering the state forest, a small barn on the land well built and maintained, a cottage simple in construction, the simplicity of something built to last rather than to impress, the cottage of a man who understood that simplicity and quality are not in opposition. The deed was in her name. The property had been paid for in full, with the deed a financial trust document. $500,000 established and funded, the beneficiary listed simply as Evelyn Ann Wren. The purpose stated with a brevity that left everything open for whatever projects or purposes Evelyn Wren chooses to pursue in the course of her new life. No conditions, no annual evaluations, no requirements of any kind. And with the trust document, a note. The last one. The handwriting slightly less controlled than the earlier letters, the handwriting of a man writing in the final months of his life when the fine motor control was beginning to go, but the clarity of what he wanted to say had not diminished at all. Evie, you have spent 40 years living the life I needed us to live. You did it without complaint and without keeping score, and with a generosity I never deserved and never adequately acknowledged. This is yours now, all of it. The house, the garden, this land, these resources. Do with any of it whatever makes you most fully yourself. I have watched you for 40 years being exactly what every situation, every person, every obligation required you to be, and I have never once seen you stop to consider what you yourself required. I hope you will consider it now. I hope Millhaven gives you the space and the time for that considering. I hope you find in whatever you decide to build or create or simply inhabit and enjoy the version of yourself that has been waiting patiently through all those years of being someone else's everything. You were always my everything. Now please be your own. With all the love I should have shown more clearly every day for 40 years. Yours always and completely. Edward. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her lap and sat looking at the wall of the study at the ordered files in the careful documentation of a life spent preparing for this moment. And she stayed with the full complexity of what she felt about the man who had made all of this, given all of this, and never while he was breathing and present and available to be spoken to, managed simply to say it plainly. She sat with both things at once, the love that was real and the failure that was also real, and the fact that the love had ultimately expressed itself in the only language Edward Hargrove had fully trusted, which was the language of careful preparation and patient legal architecture, and the quiet maintenance month after month of rose bushes in a garden 3 states away. She understood him completely now. She thought about what she wanted to do. She had been thinking about it for weeks in the same unhurried way she thought about the garden. Not as a plan exactly, but as a form emerging slowly from careful, repeated attention. The land, the barn, the cottage, the resources, and the particular quality that Millhaven had, the quality she had felt from the first day, the quality Walt Pruitt embodied, and the library held, and Constance Patterson carried with her, of a place that received people, that had room for things that mattered, that understood without needing to be told that some things require shelter to survive. She thought about women like herself. Not victims, she did not think of herself as a victim and did not intend to build something around that framing. But women who had given across long years to lives and people and structures that required everything they had and returned something less, and who had arrived at a certain point in that giving to find themselves in need of a place to stop and rest and remember who they were before the giving had become the entirety of their identity. Women who needed, in the precise and original sense of the word, a sanctuary. The word arrived in her mind with a particular click of something that fits exactly the space it was made for. She had lived in this house for 6 months and understood sanctuary from the inside, felt its meaning accumulate in the soil of the restored garden, and the conversations with Walt, and the evenings by the stone fireplace, reading books she had chosen for herself for the first time in 40 years, choosing entirely for herself and the particular quality of a town that knew her name before she arrived and had been waiting for her. She had felt what sanctuary actually was lived in. It understood it in her body. She could build that for others. Not a shelter in the institutional sense. Not a charity that positions its beneficiaries as objects of provision. Something different, a place of genuine hospitality and genuine space, where women who had spent themselves in service of other people's lives could come and be held without requirement, without pressure to be anything other than who they were in that specific moment. A place embedded in a community, drawing from that community's warmth and returning to it. She would call it the Wren House, not for Edward, not as a memorial to the marriage or a monument to what she had survived. For herself. Because Evelyn Wren was 68 years old, and she was properly beginning for the first time, with the full weight of her own agency behind the beginning to understand what she was capable of, when the capability was entirely and unambiguously her own. She made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to a contractor in Hanover, recommended by the structural engineer, to begin the conversation about what converting the barn and cottage into something purposeful would require and what it would cost. The second was to Sarah Oakes at the library, because Sarah knew Millhaven and its people and had the instinct of someone who has spent years thinking about what communities need to sustain themselves for exactly who would want to be part of building something new. She put the phone down after the second call and sat for a moment in the study in the chair that had once been Edward's and was now hers, surrounded by files that had once been his instruments and were now her insurance and perhaps eventually her history. She sat in the room where a man had spent 40 years preparing for a moment he would not be alive to see, and she felt quietly and without fanfare, in the way that real things tend to arrive, something that she recognized as gratitude. Not the performed gratitude of obligation, the genuine kind. for the house, for the roses, for the note that said, "Trust me one last time," for the fact that she had trusted and had driven north and had turned the key in the lock. That evening, Evelyn sat on the stone steps of the house as the September light went golden in the clearing. The fountain was running. She had gotten it working in early June, a Saturday morning project that had required 4 hours and a call to a plumber in Concord, and had rewarded her when the water finally moved through the old stone basin and caught the light and began its quiet sound with a satisfaction so complete and specific that she had sat beside it for a long time, simply listening. The sound water makes in a stone basin when it has been still for a long time and begins again. She listened to it, and now sitting on the steps in the September air. The roses along the south wall were in their late season flowering, the flush that good roses produce in September when the nights begin to cool, and the plants put their remaining energy into something richer and more concentrated than the abundance of June. The flowers were larger now, deeper in color, the fragrance more present. She had cut them back properly in March and fed them in May, and they had responded the way things respond to being properly attended, with a vitality that was essentially a form of gratitude. The oaks at the clearing's edge were turning. The very highest branches caught the first color red and gold, appearing at the edges of leaves that had been green all summer, the annual preparation for the display that the whole clearing would become in another few weeks. The trees stood at the edges of the space in the stillness of things that have learned across centuries of weather and season, and the so long accumulation of rings beneath their bark, that permanence is simply patience carried far enough. Evelyn looked through the main room window at the photographs still covering the walls. She had not moved any of Edward's photographs. She had added her own alongside them, photographs of the clearing in different lights. A print she had made of the fountain when it first ran again, a photograph Sarah had taken of her in the library, sitting with a stack of books, her reading glasses on, entirely absorbed in something. Her photographs beside his, her choices alongside his love. Both of them on the same walls, telling the same long story from their different perspectives. She was 68 years old. She had spent 40 years being exactly what every situation, every person, every obligation required her to be. She had been efficient and gracious and invisible and faithful and endlessly thoroughly accommodating. She had bitten her tongue and swallowed her voice and managed her interior weather with the discipline of someone who had been told in 1,000 ways across 40 years that the weather was hers alone to manage and no one else's concern. She had arrived in Millhaven with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a rusty iron key and a 5-line note from a dead man who had asked her to trust him one last time. She had arrived with what looked like nothing and discovered that the nothing had been the whole time everything. The fountain caught the September light and turned it into something that moved. The roses held their deep color against the coming of the dark. The oaks stood at the edges of the clearing in the permanence of things that have simply endured long enough to become something larger than endurance. Evelyn Wren sat on the stone steps of her house and breathed the September air of a place that was genuinely and completely hers, and she felt the specific and extraordinary lightness of a woman who is finally at 68 years old, after 40 years of being someone else's, everything begun the work of becoming her own. The fountain ran, the roses held, the oaks stood. She was just getting started.